Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
The Halfpenny in the Parish Plate, a Miss Marple mystery. Welcome to Velvet Clues. I'm your host Connor, and I'm delighted you've joined us today for another captivating mystery. Whether you're listening from a cosy armchair by the fire or walking through busy city streets, these timeless tales have a way of drawing us together across time and space. If you're enjoying our stories, please let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We love hearing from our community around the world. Now, settle in with your favourite beverage as we follow the keen observations of Miss Jane Marple through the quiet streets of St Mary Mead, where even the most innocent Sunday service can harbour the darkest secrets. Chapter 1. The Coin That Shouldn't Exist. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St Mary Mead's parish church, casting jewelled patterns across the worn stone floor, where generations of the faithful had knelt in prayer. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her best Sunday hat, a modest creation adorned with a single silk rose, and settled into her customary pew, third from the front on the left side, close enough to observe the proceedings without appearing overly curious about her neighbour's spiritual devotions. The Reverend Leonard Clement moved through the familiar rhythms of the Sunday service, with the practised ease of a man who had delivered countless sermons to the same congregation for the better part of 2 decades. His voice carried clearly through the church as he announced the morning's hymn, "All Things Bright and Beautiful," though Miss Marple couldn't help but notice that young Tommy Symington's voice was cracking rather dramatically on the higher notes. It was during the offertory that Miss Marple first noticed something amiss. As the collection plate, a heavy silver piece that had served the parish faithfully since Queen Victoria's time, made its way along her pew, she observed the usual assortment of coins and the occasional crumpled pound note. The congregation of St Mary Mead was not wealthy by any means, but they were generous within their modest circumstances. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, seated beside her in her customary spot, fumbled in her purse with the distracted air of someone who had forgotten to prepare her offering in advance. "Oh, bother," she whispered, producing a handful of change that she examined with the intensity of an accountant. "I do hope the Reverend won't think poorly of me for contributing quite so many small coins," Miss Marple murmured reassuringly, though her attention had been caught by something peculiar. As the plate passed before her, glinting in the morning light, she noticed among the usual sixpences and shillings a coin that made her pause. It was a halfpenny, certainly, but there was something distinctly odd about its appearance. The patina was wrong, too deep, too varied in colour, and there appeared to be some sort of marking on its surface that she couldn't quite make out in the brief moment it remained within her view. The plate continued its journey to Mr. Arthur Pence, the church treasurer, a meticulous man in his 70s, who had managed the parish finances with the dedication of someone who viewed every penny as a sacred trust. Miss Marple watched as he accepted the plate with his usual solemn nod, though she thought she detected a slight frown as his eyes swept over its contents. Pence was a creature of habit, as methodical in his approach to church finances as he had been during his 40-year career as a bank clerk. His weekly routine was as predictable as clockwork: collect the offertory, retire immediately to the vestry for counting and recording, then secure the funds in the ancient safe that had served the parish since 1897. The congregation had learned not to expect him at the usual post-service socialising, as he considered his fiscal duties too important to be delayed by casual conversation. After the final blessing, Miss Marple remained in her pew for a few moments longer than necessary, ostensibly organising her prayer book and gloves, but actually observing the behaviour of her fellow parishioners. Most filed out in their usual patterns, the Weatherbys making their stately progress toward the south door, young Dr. Haydock pausing to speak with several elderly patients, and the village mothers corralling their children with varying degrees of success. Mrs. Bantry had already bustled off to discuss flower arrangements with the ladies' auxiliary, leaving Miss Marple with a clear view of the vestry door. Through the slightly open portal she could see Mr. Pence at his customary table, the collection plates arranged before him with military precision. His movements seemed more agitated than usual, and she observed him pick up something small, quite possibly a coin, and examine it closely in the light of the window. The church had grown quiet except for the distant murmur of conversation from the churchyard, where clusters of parishioners lingered to exchange village gossip and commentary on the Reverend's sermon. Miss Marple rose from her pew with the careful movements of someone whose joints reminded her daily of the passage of time, but her mind remained sharp as ever, turning over the puzzle of the peculiar halfpenny. As she made her way toward the south door, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that the morning service had been marked by something more significant than the usual weekly ritual. The coin in the collection plate had disturbed her in a way she couldn't quite articulate, not merely because of its unusual appearance, but because of the context in which it had appeared. In her long experience of village life, she had learned that even the smallest anomalies often proved to be the first threads of much larger and more complex tapestries. The autumn air was crisp as she stepped outside, carrying with it the scent of burning leaves and the promise of winter's approach. She paused on the church steps, surveying the familiar scene of post-service socialization, when a commotion near the vestry window caught her attention. Young Jamie Fletcher, the bell-ringer's son, was peering through the ancient leaded glass with the concentrated intensity of a child who had discovered something fascinating. "What is it, Jamie?" Miss Marple inquired, approaching with the gentle authority that made children comfortable in her presence. "It's Mr. Pence, miss," the boy replied, his face pressed against the cool glass. "He's been ever so still for ages now, just sitting there, like he's fallen asleep at his table." Miss Marple's pulse quickened as she moved to the window. Through the wavering glass she could see Arthur Pence slumped forward over his ledger books, his grey head resting on his folded arms, in what might have appeared to be an attitude of prayer or exhaustion. But something about the absolute stillness of his form, the unnatural angle of his shoulders, sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the October morning. The halfpenny mystery was about to become something far more serious than a curious coin in a collection plate. Chapter 2. The Silence in the Vestry. The vestry door, which had stood slightly ajar during Mr. Pence's counting routine, now seemed to loom before Miss Marple like a portal to secrets she was not entirely certain she wished to discover. Young Jamie Fletcher had run to fetch his father, and within moments a small crowd had gathered outside the ancient stone building, their voices rising in the particular mixture of concern and excitement that accompanies any deviation from village routine. Dr. Haydock arrived with the brisk efficiency that had served him well through 30 years of rural medical practice. His black bag contained the tools of healing, but Miss Marple suspected that healing would not be required in this instance. The doctor's face was grave as he pushed through the small crowd, acknowledging her presence with a slight nod before approaching the vestry door. "Arthur," Dr. Haydock called, his voice carrying the authority of both medical training and long friendship. "Arthur, are you quite well?" The silence that greeted his inquiry was profound and telling. Miss Marple noticed how the doctor's shoulders tensed as he grasped the iron handle and pushed the heavy door fully open. The vestry of St. Mary Mead was a small, cramped space that served multiple functions: storage for liturgical items, changing room for the choir, and, most relevant to the current circumstances, treasury for the parish funds. Shelves lined the walls, holding everything from spare hymnals to ceremonial chalices, while a sturdy oak table dominated the centre of the room. It was at this table that Arthur Pence had performed his weekly ritual for more than a decade. Dr. Haydock's examination was brief but thorough. "I'm afraid he's gone," he announced, his voice carrying the practised calm of someone who had delivered such news far too many times. "Appears to have been quite sudden. His heart, most likely. He mentioned having some episodes of chest pain recently." Miss Marple remained in the doorway, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her. Mr. Pence sat in his chair as if he had simply laid his head down for a moment's rest, his right hand still holding his fountain pen, the other resting palm down on the open ledger. The collection plates remained on the table, their contents apparently undisturbed, though she noted that the silver plate she had contributed to was positioned at an odd angle, as if it had been turned or moved. The Reverend Clement arrived, slightly out of breath from his hurried journey from the rectory. His face bore the expression of a man whose quiet Sunday had suddenly become complicated by tragedy. "Arthur was a pillar of this parish," he murmured, removing his hat in the presence of death. 40 years of faithful service. We shall miss him terribly." Inspector Slack of the County Constabulary was summoned as a matter of course, though the circumstances appeared straightforward enough. He arrived with his customary air of barely concealed irritation, as if the very act of being called to investigate anything in St. Mary Mead was a personal affront to his professional dignity. Natural causes, by the look of it, Inspector Slack pronounced, after conferring briefly with Dr. Haydock. Elderly gentleman, history of heart problems, found at his usual Sunday duties. Nothing suspicious here. He made a few perfunctory notes in his official book, but his attention seemed already focused on returning to whatever Sunday afternoon activities had been interrupted by the call. Miss Marple, however, found herself troubled by several small details that others seemed to have overlooked. While Inspector Slack and Dr. Haydock discussed the procedures for removing the body, she studied the arrangement of items on the vestry table. The ledger lay open to the current week's entry, and she could see that Mr. Pence had begun his usual meticulous recording of the morning's collection. The entry, written in his careful copperplate hand, showed the date and began with notations for the larger denominations, 7 shillings, but the entry ended abruptly, the pen having dropped a small blot of ink where his hand had relaxed. More interesting still was what lay beside the ledger, a magnifying glass that Mr. Pence certainly did not customarily use for his counting duties, and, next to it, isolated from the other coins, the halfpenny that had caught Miss Marple's attention during the service. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "I wonder if you might examine that coin more closely. I noticed something peculiar about it during the offertory." Inspector Slack glanced at the halfpenny with the casual attention of someone eager to conclude his investigation. "Just a common halfpenny, Miss Marple. Nothing unusual about it that I can see." But Miss Marple persisted, pointing out the deep patina and what appeared to be markings on the coin's surface. Mr. Pence had placed it apart from the others and was examining it with a magnifying glass when he passed away. Perhaps it's worth a closer look. Reluctantly, Inspector Slack picked up the magnifying glass and held it over the coin. What he saw made his expression change from casual dismissal to sharp interest. Under magnification, the halfpenny revealed its secrets. It was indeed much older than a casual glance would suggest, possibly Victorian in origin, and etched into its surface, barely visible to the naked eye, were tiny letters forming what appeared to be initials. W.M. "Well," Inspector Slack muttered, "that's rather odd. Custom engraving on a halfpenny. Can't say I've seen that before." Dr. Haydock, who had been preparing to arrange for the removal of Mr. Pence's body, looked up with interest. Arthur did have quite a keen eye for unusual coins, collected them as a hobby, you know. Perhaps he recognized something special about this one. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, though she suspected there was more to the story than a simple collector's interest. The question is, who contributed this particular coin to the collection, and why would they choose such an unusual piece for a church offering? The afternoon light was beginning to fade as the official procedures concluded, and Arthur Pence's body was removed from the vestry with the dignity befitting a man who had served his community faithfully for so many years. The collection money would be counted and secured by the Reverend himself, pending the appointment of a new treasurer, and the church would return to its normal rhythm of quiet worship and community service. But Miss Marple carried away with her the image of the isolated halfpenny and the magnifying glass, and a growing conviction that Arthur Pence's death might have been precipitated by a discovery that someone had preferred to remain hidden. The mystery of the engraved coin was only beginning to reveal its secrets. Chapter 3. The Ledger's Missing Page. The Monday morning following Arthur Pence's death dawned grey and overcast, with the sort of persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into the very stones of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple had spent a restless night turning over the events in the vestry, her mind nagging at details that Inspector Slack had dismissed as inconsequential. After a modest breakfast of toast and marmalade, she decided that a visit to the church might provide some clarity, or at least satisfy her curiosity about the peculiar circumstances surrounding Mr. Pence's final moments. The Reverend Clement was in the vestry when she arrived, his usually composed demeanour showing signs of strain as he attempted to make sense of Arthur's meticulous filing system. Papers were spread across the oak table in organised chaos, and the collection money from the previous day lay in neat stacks awaiting transfer to the bank. "Miss Marple," the Reverend greeted her with obvious relief. "How good of you to come. I confess I'm rather overwhelmed by Arthur's record-keeping. The man was incredibly thorough, perhaps too thorough for someone of my limited bookkeeping abilities." Miss Marple approached the table with the careful interest of someone genuinely eager to help, though her true motivation was to examine more closely the ledger that had been opened at the time of Mr. Pence's death. Arthur was indeed meticulous, she agreed, noting how the pages were filled with his precise handwriting, each entry carefully dated and cross-referenced. Perhaps I might assist. I did help with the parish accounts many years ago, before Arthur took over the position. The Reverend's face brightened considerably. That would be tremendously helpful. I must admit, some of Arthur's systems are quite beyond me. He gestured toward a stack of receipt books and correspondence that covered one corner of the table. He seemed to keep records of everything, down to the smallest expenditure. Miss Marple began her examination with the ledger that had been open at the time of Mr. Pence's death. The final entry, as she had observed the day before, remained unfinished. £2, 7 shillings. The ink blot where his pen had fallen marking the moment his life had ended. But as she studied the book more carefully, something troubled her. "Reverend," she said carefully, "I noticed that several pages appear to be missing from this ledger. See here, where the page numbers jump from 47 to 50. That suggests 3 pages have been removed, rather recently." She examined the binding more closely, noting the clean edges where pages had been carefully cut out. The removal was done with a sharp blade, quite deliberately. The Reverend frowned, joining her examination of the ledger. How very odd. Arthur would never have removed pages from an official record. He was absolutely scrupulous about maintaining complete documentation for the diocese audits. This discovery cast Arthur Pence's death in a new light. If pages had been removed from the parish ledger, and removed recently, judging by the clean cuts, then someone had been tampering with the church's financial records. The question was whether Arthur had discovered this tampering, or whether someone had removed the pages after his death while the vestry stood temporarily unguarded. Miss Marple continued her examination of the papers spread across the table, noting Arthur's careful categorization of every transaction. His system included not only the weekly collection totals, but detailed breakdowns of special offerings, memorial donations, and even notes about unusual contributions. It was in this latter category that she made her next significant discovery. "Reverend, look at this notation from last month," she said, pointing to an entry in Arthur's precise handwriting. "Anonymous donation, 1 Victorian halfpenny, approximately 1887, with custom engraving. Note, appears to be of numismatic interest. Contributor unknown. Investigation pending." The Reverend read the entry with growing surprise. A Victorian halfpenny? But surely such a coin would be worth considerably more than its face value to a collector. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, which raises the question of why someone would contribute it to the church collection, and, more importantly, why Arthur felt the need to investigate its origin. She turned the page, looking for any follow-up entries, but found only routine collection records. It appears this was not the first time such a coin had appeared in the collection. As she continued to study the ledger, Miss Marple made another disturbing discovery. The missing pages appeared to correspond to the period when Arthur had first noted the appearance of unusual coins in the collection. If someone had deliberately removed these records, they might have been trying to conceal a pattern of similar contributions, or perhaps to hide Arthur's investigation into their source. "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that we should contact Inspector Slack. Arthur's death may not have been as natural as it first appeared." The Reverend's face grew pale. "Surely you don't suspect. But who would want to harm Arthur? He was the most honest, straightforward man in the parish." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied. "His honesty was exactly the problem. If Arthur had discovered something irregular about the church finances, something worth killing to keep secret, then his reputation for integrity would have made him a very dangerous man indeed." As if summoned by their conversation, they heard footsteps in the church proper, followed by voices discussing the arrangements for Arthur's funeral. Mrs. Bantry appeared in the vestry doorway, her face creased with concern and curiosity. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, "but I wanted to offer my help with the arrangements. Poor Arthur had no family to speak of, and we mustn't let him go to his rest without proper recognition of his service to the parish." Miss Marple seized the opportunity. "Dolly, you knew Arthur as well as anyone. Did he ever mention concerns about the church finances? Any irregularities or problems he might have discovered?" Mrs. Bantry considered the question carefully. Well, now that you mention it, he did seem rather preoccupied these past few weeks. Asked me several questions about the history of certain families in the parish, particularly the Weatherbys and the Mordaunts. Said he was researching some historical donations, but he seemed troubled about something. This information added another piece to the puzzle. The Weatherby and Mordaunt families had been prominent in St Mary Mead for generations, with substantial holdings in the area and long histories of charitable giving to the church. If Arthur had been investigating their donation patterns, he might have uncovered something that certain parties preferred to keep hidden. Miss Marple carefully closed the ledger, her mind working through the implications of what they had discovered. The missing pages, the notation about the Victorian halfpenny, Arthur's recent inquiries about prominent families, all suggested that the faithful treasurer had stumbled upon something far more significant than an unusual coin in the collection plate. The drizzle outside had intensified, and the grey light filtering through the vestry window gave the small room a melancholy atmosphere. But Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of intellectual excitement that accompanied the early stages of a complex puzzle. Arthur Pence had died with secrets, and those secrets were calling out for investigation. The mystery of the halfpenny was deepening, and she suspected that before it was resolved, several reputations in St Mary Mead would be subjected to very uncomfortable scrutiny. Indeed. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Bell Tower. The revelation of the missing ledger pages had convinced Inspector Slack to take a more serious view of Arthur Pence's death, though he approached the investigation with his characteristic blend of scepticism and bureaucratic thoroughness. Tuesday morning found him in the church vestry, examining the financial records with the grudging attention of someone who would have preferred to close the case as a simple heart attack. Miss Marple, having been unofficially deputised to assist with the parish records, used this arrangement to pursue her own lines of inquiry. While Inspector Slack counted collection money and muttered about missing pages, she made her way to the bell tower, where young Jamie Fletcher was practising his rope work under the watchful eye of his father, Tom Fletcher, the head bell ringer. The bell tower of St Mary Mead rose 4 stories above the church proper, its stone steps worn smooth by centuries of bell ringers climbing to their duties. The ringing chamber, where the bell ropes hung in neat rows, occupied the 2nd floor and provided an excellent vantage point for observing the comings and goings in the churchyard below. "Mrs. Marple," Tom Fletcher greeted her as she climbed the last few steps, slightly out of breath from the ascent. "Young Jamie mentioned you were asking questions about Mr. Pence yesterday. Terrible business, his passing. The man was a saint, if you ask me. Never missed a Sunday in all the years I've known him." Jamie, still flushed with the importance of having been the first to notice something amiss with Mr. Pence, nodded eagerly. "He was always so particular about his counting, Mrs. Marple. Never liked to be disturbed when he was working with the collection money. Said it was a sacred trust." Miss Marple settled herself carefully on the wooden bench that ran along one wall of the ringing chamber, her knitting bag in her lap, and her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the room. "I'm sure he was very conscientious, Tom. I wonder if you might have noticed anything unusual about the church recently? Any strangers hanging about, or regular parishioners behaving oddly?" Tom Fletcher considered the question while checking the tension on one of the bell ropes. He was a methodical man, as most bell ringers had to be, with the sort of practical wisdom that came from years of observing human nature from his elevated perch. "Well," he said slowly, "there was something rather odd a few weeks ago. I was up here practising for the Harvest Festival when I noticed old Mr. Mordaunt having what looked like a rather heated discussion with someone in the churchyard. Couldn't see who it was from this angle, but their voices were raised and Mr. Mordaunt seemed quite agitated." This caught Miss Marple's attention immediately. The Mordaunt family had been among those Arthur Pence had been researching, according to Mrs. Bantry's recollection. "Could you hear what they were discussing?" "Bits and pieces," Tom replied. "Something about property boundaries and old agreements. Mr. Mordaunt kept saying it was settled years ago, but the other person seemed to be disagreeing. Then Mr. Pence came out of the vestry, and the argument stopped quite suddenly." Jamie piped up with the eagerness of youth. "I was here too, Mrs. Marple, and I saw who it was. It was Mr. Weatherby from the big house. He looked ever so angry, and when he saw Mr. Pence he went quite pale and hurried away without saying goodbye to Mr. Mordaunt." Mrs. Marple absorbed this information with interest, Both the Wetherby and Mordaunt families had extensive property holdings around St Mary Mead, and disputes over boundaries had been known to simmer for generations in rural communities. But what did property disputes have to do with unusual coins appearing in the church collection? "Tom," she said carefully, "in your years of bell ringing, have you ever noticed anything unusual about the collection process? Any particular patterns in how people contribute, or anyone who seemed to take unusual interest in the offertory?" Tom Fletcher's weathered face creased in concentration. "Now that you mention it, there have been times when I've noticed people watching Mr. Pence very carefully during the counting. Usually folks just leave after the service, but sometimes there'd be someone lingering in the churchyard, almost like they were waiting to see when he finished with the money. Anyone in particular? Well, Mr. Wetherby, for one. He'd often stay behind, said he was tending his family's graves. But I noticed he always positioned himself where he could see into the vestry window. And there was a stranger too, about a month ago. Older gentleman, well-dressed, who seemed very interested in our collection procedures. Asked me several questions about Mr. Pence's schedule and whether he always counted the money immediately after service. This mention of a stranger was particularly intriguing. Miss Marple made a mental note to inquire further about any unfamiliar visitors to the parish. "Can you describe this gentleman?" Jamie answered before his father could speak. "He had a funny accent, Mrs. Marple. Not foreign exactly, but different from around here. And he had a notebook where he was writing things down. I thought maybe he was from the diocese, checking up on our procedures." The implications of this information were troubling. If someone had been conducting surveillance of Arthur Pence's routine, noting when and how he handled the collection money, it suggested a level of premeditation that went far beyond casual interest. Combined with the missing ledger pages and the mysterious Victorian halfpenny, a picture was emerging of something much more complex than a simple heart attack. Miss Marple spent another hour in the bell tower, drawing out additional details from the Fletchers about unusual occurrences in recent weeks. It transpired that there had been several instances of strangers showing interest in the church, asking questions about the history of the building, the parish records, or the collection procedures. Each instance alone might have been innocent. Taken together, they suggested a coordinated effort to gather intelligence about the church's operations. As she prepared to descend the worn stone steps, Tom Fletcher offered one final observation. "Mrs. Marple, there's something else that might be relevant. Last Wednesday, when I came to practice for Sunday service, I found the vestry door standing open. Mr. Pence was very particular about keeping it locked when he wasn't there, but someone had been inside. Nothing seemed to be missing, but the papers on his table had been disturbed." Miss Marple paused on the threshold of the ringing chamber. "Did you mention this to Arthur?" "I did indeed. He was quite concerned. Had me help him check all the financial records. Said everything appeared to be in order, but he asked me to keep an eye out for any other irregularities. Made me promise to tell him immediately if I noticed anything else unusual." The afternoon sun was breaking through the morning's grey clouds as Miss Marple made her way down from the bell tower, her mind busy with the connections between the various threads of information she had gathered. The picture that was emerging suggested that Arthur Pence had been the target of sustained observation and possibly attempted interference with the church finances. The question remained, what had he discovered that was worth killing to conceal? The mystery of the halfpenny was revealing itself to be part of a much larger and more dangerous puzzle, one that reached back into the history of St Mary Mead itself and the long-standing relationships between its most prominent families. Chapter 5. The Map Beneath the Floorboards. Wednesday morning brought Inspector Slack to Miss Marple's cottage with news that confirmed her growing suspicions about Arthur Pence's death. Dr. Haydock had completed a more thorough examination of the body and discovered something troubling. Traces of digitalis in the blood, far exceeding any therapeutic dosage that might have been prescribed for a heart condition. Digitalis comes from foxglove, Inspector Slack explained, as they sat in Miss Marple's tidy sitting room, his official notebook balanced on his knee. Common enough plant around here, grows wild in most gardens, but the concentration Dr. Haydock found suggests it wasn't accidental ingestion. Someone deliberately administered a lethal dose. Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision that masked her inner excitement. Murder, then, as she had suspected. I imagine you'll be wanting to question the entire congregation about their whereabouts on Sunday morning. Among other things, Inspector Slack agreed grimly, but I'm particularly interested in this business about the missing ledger pages and the Victorian halfpenny. You mentioned that Arthur had been investigating certain families in the parish. Miss Marple nodded, then shared the information she had gathered from the Fletchers about the suspicious activities around the church in recent weeks. Inspector Slack made careful notes, his irritation at having to deal with another St. Mary Mead mystery gradually giving way to professional interest as the complexity of the case became apparent. "There's something else," Miss Marple added. "I've been thinking about that engraved halfpenny and what might make it significant enough to kill for. Victorian coins with custom engravings are not uncommon, but they might have value beyond their numismatic worth if they represented something specific, a key to a code, perhaps, or a marker for something hidden." Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose. "You think the coin was some sort of signal or identifier?" "It's possible. Arthur noted in his ledger that similar coins had appeared before, which suggests a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Someone has been using the church collection as a means of communication." Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Bantry, who burst through the front door with the dramatic flair that marked her more exciting announcements. "Jane, the most extraordinary thing has happened. They're digging up the floor in the church vestry." This news required immediate investigation. Miss Marple and Inspector Slack followed Mrs. Bantry back to the church, where they found a scene of controlled chaos. The Reverend Clement stood to one side, looking distinctly uncomfortable, while two workmen in overalls prized up the ancient stone flagstones that had formed the vestry floor for centuries. "What's all this about?" Inspector Slack demanded, his official authority asserting itself. The Reverend looked even more uncomfortable. "I'm afraid we had a bit of a flood from a broken pipe in the cellar. When the workmen came to assess the damage, they discovered that several of the stones were loose, much more recent than the others. It appears someone has been beneath the floor relatively recently." Indeed, as the workmen lifted away the newer stones, it became apparent that a section of the floor had been carefully replaced, the mortar still showing signs of recent work. Beneath the stones lay a cavity that had been deliberately excavated, lined with oiled cloth to protect its contents from moisture. "Well, I'll be—" one of the workmen muttered, then remembered where he was and apologized hastily to the Reverend. "Begging your pardon, sir, but look what's down here." The cavity contained several items wrapped in waterproof covering, a metal strongbox, several rolls of age paper, and, most intriguingly, what appeared to be a detailed map of the St. Mary Mead area, marked with symbols and notations in various hands. Inspector Slack took charge of the discovery, carefully lifting each item from its hiding place, while Miss Marple observed with keen interest. The map, when unrolled, proved to be a professional surveyor's chart from the 1880s, showing property boundaries and land ownership throughout the parish. But it was the annotations that made it truly remarkable. "Look at these markings," Miss Marple pointed out, studying the map over Inspector Slack's shoulder. "Someone has traced property lines in different coloured inks, and there are notes about disputed boundaries and irregular transfers." She pointed to an area near the church itself. "And see here, there's a notation about original boundary stones and evidence of fraudulent survey." The map revealed what appeared to be a systematic investigation into property disputes dating back to the Victorian era. Several prominent families were mentioned in the annotations, including the Weatherbys and Mordaunts, with detailed notes about questionable land transfers and potential forgeries in the original deeds. The strongbox, when forced open, yielded an even more startling collection of documents: original property deeds, some showing signs of alteration, correspondence between various land agents and solicitors, and, most damning of all, what appeared to be draft copies of fraudulent survey reports designed to obscure the true boundaries of several large estates. "My word," breathed the Reverend, reading over one of the altered deeds. "This suggests that the current property lines for several major holdings in the parish are based on falsified documents." Miss Marple was studying one particular deed with intense concentration. "Inspector, look at the signature on this document. See how it's been carefully altered, and notice the watermark. This paper is much newer than the supposed date of the deed." Inspector Slack was beginning to understand the implications. You're saying someone has been systematically falsifying land records to steal property? It appears so, Miss Marple confirmed, and Arthur Pence, with his keen eye for detail and his responsibility for the church's own property records, had discovered the fraud. The Victorian halfpenny wasn't just a coin, it was a signal, probably indicating that someone was ready to reveal the truth about the falsified deeds. The afternoon sun was slanting through the vestry window, illuminating the scattered documents and maps that told a story of long-term fraud and deception. Arthur Pence had been killed not for discovering a simple financial irregularity, but for uncovering a conspiracy that reached back decades and involved some of the most prominent families in St. Mary Mead. The question now, Miss Marple mused, studying the map once more, is which of our respectable neighbours was desperate enough to commit murder to protect their ill-gotten gains? The mystery of the halfpenny had led them to something much larger and more complex than anyone had imagined, a web of deception that struck at the very foundations of the village's social order. Chapter 6. The Hymn Sheet's Secret Message. Thursday brought with it a development that Miss Marple had not anticipated, though, in retrospect, she realised she should have foreseen it. Young Jamie Fletcher arrived at her cottage shortly after breakfast, clutching a wrinkled piece of paper and wearing the expression of someone who had made a discovery of considerable importance. "Mrs. Marple," he announced breathlessly, "I found something in the bell tower that I think you ought to see. It was tucked behind one of the rope guides, like someone had hidden it there deliberately." Miss Marple invited the boy into her sitting room and examined the paper he presented with interest. It was a hymn sheet from the previous Sunday's service, all things bright and beautiful, but this particular copy bore several peculiar markings that had nothing to do with musical notation. In the margins of the hymn sheet, someone had written a series of numbers and letters in pencil. March 12th, 47 appeared at the top, followed by boundary stone moved 1,187 inches, and original survey contradicts current deed. At the bottom of the page, in a different hand, was written, "Sunday collection confirms. Proceed with revelation." "Jamie," Miss Marple said carefully, "where exactly did you find this? And was anyone else in the bell tower recently who might have hidden it there?" The boy's face scrunched in concentration. "It was wedged right behind the rope for the tenor bell, Mrs. Marple. You'd have to know exactly where to look to find it. And the only person who's been up there besides me and Dad was Mr. Pence. He came up last Thursday to ask Dad about the view from the tower. Wanted to know if you could see into people's gardens and such from up there." This information cast Arthur Pence's death in an even more sinister light. The hymn sheet appeared to be part of a communication system, with the initials WM corresponding to the engraving found on the Victorian halfpenny. Someone had been using the church itself as a meeting place for clandestine correspondence, and Arthur had discovered their system. Miss Marple studied the handwriting more closely. The notation about boundary stones and surveys was written in a careful, educated hand, possibly that of a professional surveyor or solicitor. The final comment about Sunday collection confirms was in a different script entirely, more hurried and less refined. "I think," Miss Marple said to Jamie, "that you should take this directly to Inspector Slack. It's evidence in a very serious matter, and he needs to see it immediately." As Jamie hurried away with his important mission, Miss Marple found herself pondering the implications of the hymn sheet discovery. The communication system it revealed suggested a conspiracy involving at least two people, one of whom had access to professional surveying information, and another who was monitoring the church collections for signals. The reference to a boundary stone being moved in 1887 was particularly intriguing, as it corresponded with the date of the Victorian halfpenny that had appeared in Sunday's collection. Someone was using historical land fraud as the basis for blackmail or extortion, and Arthur Pence had stumbled upon their scheme. Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage within the hour, accompanied by a constable, and wearing the expression of a man whose simple murder investigation had become inconveniently complex. He examined the hymn sheet with the professional attention it deserved, making careful notes about the handwriting and the specific references to boundary stones and surveys. "This changes everything," he admitted grudgingly. "We're not looking at a single killer acting alone. This suggests an organized conspiracy. possibly involving multiple people over an extended period of time. Miss Marple nodded in agreement. The question is whether Arthur was killed because he had discovered the truth about the land fraud, or because he was threatening to expose the people involved in the conspiracy. The timing suggests the latter. Someone became desperate when they realized their secret communication system had been compromised. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, who brought news of his continued investigation into Arthur's death. "I've completed the full toxicology examination," he announced, "and there's something rather peculiar about the digitalis poisoning. The concentration suggests a very precise dosage, enough to cause fatal heart failure, but administered in a way that would initially appear natural." Inspector Slack looked up from his notes. "You're saying someone with medical knowledge was involved?" "Possibly," Dr. Haydock replied carefully. "Or someone with extensive knowledge of plant toxins and their effects. The digitalis appears to have been administered in tea or coffee. There are traces of caffeine in the system as well, and the timing of absorption suggests the poison was consumed shortly before death." This information narrowed the field of suspects considerably. Arthur's routine on Sunday mornings was well known. After collecting and counting the offertory, he customarily had a cup of tea in the vestry before securing the money in the parish safe. Someone had poisoned his Sunday tea, knowing his habits well enough to time the fatal dose precisely. Miss Marple was considering the implications of this when Mrs. Bantry appeared at the cottage door, her face flushed with excitement and concern. "Jane, you must come immediately. There's been quite a commotion at the Weatherby house. Police cars everywhere, and I saw them carrying out boxes of documents." Inspector Slack was on his feet immediately. "I gave no orders for a search of the Weatherby property. Who authorized this action?" Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled. "I assumed it was your doing, Inspector, but now that you mention it, the men didn't look like local constables. They had a very official appearance. Definitely some sort of government authority." The implications of this development were troubling. If other agencies were investigating the land fraud conspiracy, it suggested that the scope of the criminal activity extended far beyond St. Mary Mead. Arthur Pence might have uncovered something that threatened interests powerful enough to warrant official investigation at the highest levels. Miss Marple gathered her coat and handbag with determined efficiency. "I think we should pay a visit to the Weatherby house immediately. If there are other investigators involved in this matter, we need to understand what they know and how it relates to Arthur's murder." As they made their way through the village toward the imposing Georgian facade of Weatherby Hall, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the escalating complexity of the case. What had begun as the mystery of an unusual coin in a collection plate had revealed itself as part of a conspiracy involving land fraud, blackmail, and murder, and now it appeared that the tentacles of the conspiracy reached far beyond their quiet village. The hymn sheet had provided the key to understanding the communication system used by the conspirators, but it had also raised new questions about the identity and motivations of those involved. Someone in St. Mary Mead was desperate enough to kill to protect their secrets, and Miss Marple was determined to discover who before they struck again. Chapter 7. The Weatherby family's dark secret. The scene at Weatherby Hall was indeed as dramatic as Mrs. Bantry had described. Official-looking vehicles lined the circular drive, and men in dark suits moved with purposeful efficiency between the house and several large vans. Inspector Slack's attempts to assert his authority were met with polite but firm resistance from a tall gentleman who introduced himself merely as Morrison from the Land Registry Office. "I'm afraid this is a matter of national importance, Inspector," Morrison explained, his tone suggesting that local murder investigations were of secondary concern to whatever larger issues were at stake. "We've been tracking irregularities in property registrations across several counties, and the Weatherby holdings appear to be central to a much larger fraud." Miss Marple observed the proceedings from a respectful distance, noting the careful way the investigators handled the documents they removed from the house. These were not the hasty actions of people conducting a routine search, but the methodical work of experts who knew exactly what they were looking for. Sir Reginald Weatherby stood on the front steps of his ancestral home, his face ashen and his hands trembling as he watched the systematic dismantling of his family's carefully maintained secrets. He was a man in his 70s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and respect, but now he appeared diminished and frightened. "Miss Marple," he called out when he noticed her among the small crowd of village onlookers. Perhaps you might spare a moment. I find myself in need of advice from someone of discretion." Inspector Slack started to object, but Morrison waved him away with casual authority. "Let us speak with him. Sometimes these local matters provide useful context for our larger investigation." Miss Marple approached Sir Reginald with the gentle dignity that had always served her well in delicate situations. Up close, she could see that he was not merely frightened, but genuinely ill. His complexion was grey, and his breathing appeared laboured. "Sir Reginald," she said quietly, "I understand you're facing some difficult questions about your property holdings." He nodded miserably. "It's all coming apart, Miss Marple. Generations of careful management, decades of maintaining the estate, and now they're saying it was all built on fraud. They're claiming my grandfather falsified surveys and bribed officials to expand our holdings illegally." Miss Marple studied his face carefully, looking for signs of deception. What she saw was not the cunning of a practiced liar, but the genuine anguish of someone whose world was collapsing around him. "Did you know about your grandfather's activities when you inherited the estate?" "I suspected something wasn't right," he admitted. "There were irregularities in some of the older deeds, discrepancies between the original surveys and later modifications. But I told myself it was just the confusion of Victorian record-keeping. I didn't want to know the truth." This confession aligned with Miss Marple's growing understanding of the case. Sir Reginald had inherited not just property, but also the consequences of his grandfather's fraudulent activities. The question was how this connected to Arthur Pence's murder. "Sir Reginald," she said carefully, "I need to ask you about last Sunday morning. Can you account for your whereabouts between the end of church service and Mr. Pence's death?" His face crumpled further. "I was here at the house, going through the estate papers. I'd received an anonymous letter the previous week, warning me that someone was investigating the property boundaries. I was trying to understand what evidence might exist of my grandfather's irregularities." "An anonymous letter?" Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Do you still have it?" Sir Reginald gestured helplessly toward the house, where investigators continued their systematic search. "They've taken everything, but I can tell you what it said. The truth about the 1887 boundary changes is about to be revealed. Prepare for consequences." It was signed only with the initials W.M., the initials from the engraved halfpenny and the hymn sheet. Miss Marple was beginning to see the shape of the conspiracy, though the identity of the mysterious W.M. remained elusive. Someone had been systematically investigating the Victorian land fraud and preparing to expose it, using Arthur Pence's position as church treasurer to communicate their findings. "During your grandfather's time, were there other families involved in these irregular property transfers? The Mordaunts, perhaps?" His nod was reluctant but definitive. "The Mordaunts, yes, and several others. It wasn't just our family. There was a whole network of landowners who benefited from falsified surveys and bribed officials. My grandfather kept detailed records of all the participants, probably as insurance against betrayal." This revelation explained the scope of the conspiracy and the desperation that had led to Arthur's murder. Multiple prominent families had built their current prosperity on Victorian-era fraud, and someone had been threatening to expose the entire network. The question remained, who was W.M., and why had they chosen this particular moment to reveal the truth? Inspector Slack approached as their conversation concluded, his expression indicating that his patience with being excluded from the larger investigation was wearing thin. "Miss Marple, Morrison wants to speak with you. Apparently your reputation for solving village mysteries has reached official circles." Morrison proved to be a man of few words, but considerable intelligence. He listened carefully as Miss Marple explained the connection between Arthur Pence's murder and the land fraud conspiracy, making occasional notes in a leather-bound book. "The individual you refer to as W.M. has been providing us with information for several months," Morrison revealed. "Their evidence has been crucial in building our case against the families involved in the Victorian fraud. However, we weren't aware that someone had been murdered to suppress this information." Miss Marple felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "So, W.M. is your informant, working to expose the land fraud from within the village. Arthur Pence discovered their communication system and was killed because someone feared he would reveal their identity." Morrison's expression suggested she was on the right track. The question now is which of the conspirators was desperate enough to commit murder. We know the identities of the families involved in the original fraud, but determining who among their current descendants knew about it and was willing to kill to protect it, that's where we need local knowledge. As they spoke, Miss Marple noticed a familiar figure approaching the house. Mr. Mordaunt, looking considerably older than his 75 years, walked with the careful steps of someone carrying a heavy burden. His presence at the Weatherby investigation was telling. It suggested that the conspiracy was about to claim another victim, or perhaps reveal another conspirator. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant across the village, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the secrets that were finally coming to light. The mystery of the halfpenny had led them to uncover a conspiracy spanning generations, but the identity of the murderer still remained hidden among the respectable families of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple suspected that before the day was over, the careful facade of village respectability would be shattered, revealing truths that some had been willing to kill to protect. Chapter 8. The Confession in the Crypt. Friday evening brought an unexpected summons that would prove to be the turning point in the investigation. Miss Marple was enjoying a quiet supper when a note arrived, delivered by a nervous village boy who disappeared immediately after pressing the envelope into her hands. The message was brief, but urgent. "Meet me in the church crypt at 9. Come alone. I have information about Arthur's death. W.M." Miss Marple considered the wisdom of responding to such a mysterious invitation, particularly given the recent murder, but her curiosity ultimately overcame her caution. She did, however, take the precaution of leaving a sealed note for Inspector Slack to be delivered if she failed to return by 10 o'clock. The church crypt of St. Mary Mead was an ancient space beneath the chancel, accessible only through a narrow stone staircase that descended from the vestry. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of old stone and centuries of quiet repose. Electric lighting had been installed some years earlier, but the bulbs cast harsh shadows that made the carved stone monuments appear to move in the flickering illumination. Miss Marple arrived precisely at 9, her footsteps echoing in the confined space as she made her way carefully down the worn steps. The crypt housed the tombs of prominent parishioners dating back to the 14th century, their carved effigies bearing silent witness to generations of village history. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple," a voice emerged from the shadows near the oldest section of the crypt, where the medieval tombs bore the weathered arms of families long extinct. As the speaker stepped into the circle of electric light, Miss Marple saw a figure she had not expected, Mrs. Winifred Mordaunt, the elderly widow who had lived quietly in the village for more than 40 years. Mrs. Mordaunt was a small, precise woman in her early 70s, known for her charitable work and her extensive knowledge of local history. She had served on various church committees over the decades and was generally regarded as one of the more respectable pillars of village society. To find her in these circumstances, claiming to be the mysterious W.M., was genuinely surprising. "Mrs. Mordaunt," Miss Marple said gently, settling herself on a stone bench near one of the newer tombs. "I confess I hadn't considered you as our mysterious correspondent. You've been investigating the land fraud?" Mrs. Mordaunt nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "For the better part of 3 years, Miss Marple, ever since I discovered certain documents among my late husband's papers that revealed the truth about how our family acquired its current holdings." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a leather portfolio, its contents carefully organized with the methodical attention to detail that had characterized her church work. "My husband's grandfather was involved in the conspiracy with Sir Reginald's grandfather and several others. They systematically falsified property surveys, bribed registry officials, and forged deeds to steal thousands of acres from their rightful owners." Miss Marple accepted the portfolio and examined its contents by the harsh electric light. The documents told a damning story of coordinated fraud spanning decades of the Victorian era. Surveys had been altered to show property boundaries that favoured the conspirators. Original deeds had been replaced with forgeries, and, in some cases, entire families had been cheated out of their ancestral lands. "The scale is breathtaking," Miss Marple observed. "This wasn't opportunistic crime. It was systematic theft, organised at the highest levels of county society." Indeed, Mrs. Mordaunt agreed bitterly, and the benefits have been passed down through generations. Every family involved built their current prosperity on stolen land. When I discovered the truth, I knew I had to find a way to make restitution, but I also knew that simply revealing the evidence wouldn't be enough. These families have had more than a century to establish their legitimacy. They would fight any attempt at exposure. Miss Marple was beginning to understand the complexity of Mrs. Mordaunt's situation. So, you contacted the Land Registry Office and began working with them to build an official case. Precisely. But I needed a way to communicate with their investigators without arousing suspicion in the village. The church collection provided the perfect opportunity. I could place coded messages where they would be noticed by Arthur, who, I knew, would investigate anything unusual about the parish finances. The Victorian halfpennies with their engraved initials had been signals indicating when Mrs. Mordaunt had new information to share, or when she needed to arrange a meeting with the official investigators. Arthur Pence, with his keen eye for financial irregularities, had noticed the unusual coins and begun his own investigation into their significance. "But Arthur discovered your identity," Miss Marple continued, "and someone killed him to prevent him from revealing what he knew." Mrs. Mordaunt's face crumpled with grief. "I never intended for Arthur to be hurt. He was such a good man, so dedicated to the church and the community. When he approached me last Thursday, asking questions about the historical donations and my knowledge of the Victorian families, I realised he had figured out my involvement in the investigation." Miss Marple studied Mrs. Mordaunt's expression carefully. The older woman was clearly distressed, but there was something else in her manner, a quality of guilt that seemed to extend beyond simple regret over Arthur's death. "Mrs. Mordaunt," Miss Marple said quietly, "I need to ask you directly. Did you kill Arthur Pence?" The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sound of wind moving through the church above them. When Mrs. Mordaunt finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I gave him the digitalis," she said, tears beginning to flow down her weathered cheeks. "But I never meant for him to die, Miss Marple. I only wanted him to become ill enough that he couldn't continue his investigation until the official inquiry was complete." The confession hung in the air between them, like a physical presence. Miss Marple felt the familiar sadness that accompanied such moments, the realization that even the most well-intentioned actions could lead to tragic consequences. "Tell me what happened," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Mordaunt composed herself with visible effort. Arthur had figured out that I was WM, and he was planning to confront me publicly at Sunday service. He believed I was stealing from the church, using the collection to pass secret messages for some sort of criminal purpose. He couldn't conceive that I was actually working to expose criminality. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small glass vial. "I grow foxglove in my garden for medicinal purposes. My late husband used it for his heart condition, under doctor's supervision. I knew that a small amount would cause chest pains and shortness of breath, symptoms that would require bed rest and prevent Arthur from making his planned announcement." Miss Marple examined the vial, noting the precise measurements marked on its side. "You calculated the dosage based on your husband's medical treatment." "I thought I was being careful," Mrs. Mordaunt said miserably. "I added just enough to his Sunday tea to make him feel unwell. But Arthur's heart was weaker than I knew, and what should have been a mild dose proved fatal." The tragedy was complete. A well-intentioned attempt to prevent exposure had resulted in the death of an innocent man. Mrs. Mordaunt had been trying to protect her investigation into historical fraud, but her actions had made her guilty of a much more serious crime. "Mrs. Mordaunt," Miss Marple said sadly, "you'll need to come with me to Inspector Slack. The truth must be told, however painful." As they climbed the stone steps from the crypt to the world above, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of motivations that had led to this moment. Mrs. Mordaunt's desire for justice had been genuine. Her methods had been carefully planned, but a final desperate act had transformed her from investigator to criminal. The mystery of the halfpenny had been solved, but the solution brought no satisfaction, only the melancholy recognition that good intentions and tragic mistakes could coexist in the same human heart. Chapter 9. The Weight of Family Sins. The revelation of Mrs. Mordaunt's confession sent shockwaves through St. Mary Mead that reverberated far beyond the immediate circle of those involved in the investigation. Inspector Slack had arrested her for Arthur Pence's murder, though he acknowledged privately to Miss Marple that the circumstances were among the most tragic he had encountered in his career. Saturday morning found Miss Marple in the unusual position of being consulted by Morrison from the Land Registry Office, who sought her insights into the village dynamics that had contributed to the case's complex resolution. They met in the church vestry, where Arthur Pence had died just 1 week earlier, the scene now bearing no trace of the tragedy that had unfolded there. Mrs. Mordaunt's cooperation has been invaluable, Morrison explained, studying a map of the disputed properties spread across the oak table where Arthur had performed his final duties. Her evidence has allowed us to trace the full extent of the Victorian fraud conspiracy, and several families will be required to make substantial restitution to the rightful property owners. Miss Marple nodded, thoughtfully, though her attention was partially focused on the restored normality of the vestry. Collection money from the current week lay counted and recorded in neat stacks, tended by the Reverend Clement himself until a new treasurer could be appointed. "The tragedy," she observed, "is that Mrs. Mordaunt's investigation was ultimately successful. The truth about the land fraud is being exposed. The stolen properties will be restored to their rightful owners, and justice is being served. But an innocent man died because she couldn't trust him with her secret." Morrison consulted his notes, his expression grave. "She's provided us with detailed evidence about 7 major property frauds, involving thousands of acres and affecting dozens of families. The financial restitution alone will amount to millions of pounds. But as you say, the cost in human terms has been tragic." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sir Reginald Weatherby, who appeared to have aged considerably in the few days since the investigation had begun. He moved with the careful steps of someone whose world had fundamentally shifted, and his usual air of aristocratic authority had been replaced by something approaching humility. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat with old-fashioned courtesy, "I wanted to thank you for your discretion during this difficult time. I know that my family's reputation is destroyed, but you've helped ensure that the truth emerged in a way that serves justice rather than mere sensation." Miss Marple studied his weathered face with sympathy. "Sir Reginald, you weren't responsible for your grandfather's crimes. The guilt belongs to those who committed the original fraud, not to those who inherited its consequences." "Perhaps unknowingly," he replied sadly, "but I benefited from those crimes for 70 years. My entire life has been built on stolen land and fraudulent wealth. The moral weight of that inheritance is something I must carry, regardless of my personal innocence." Morrison looked up from his papers. "Sir Reginald, the Land Registry has prepared a preliminary assessment of the properties that will need to be restored. Your family will retain the original Weatherby holdings, approximately 300 acres, but you'll need to surrender the additional lands acquired through your grandfather's fraudulent activities." The practical impact of this ruling was devastating. The Weatherby family would lose nearly 2/3 of their current holdings, along with the rental income and agricultural profits that had supported their lifestyle for generations. Sir Reginald would face the prospect of selling his ancestral home and dramatically reducing his standard of living. "I understand," Sir Reginald said with quiet dignity. "My solicitor has begun the process of cataloguing which properties must be returned. We'll comply fully with whatever the investigation determines, to be just." As Morrison and Sir Reginald discussed the technical details of the property transfers, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the broader implications of the case. The Victorian land fraud conspiracy had created a web of unearned privilege and inherited guilt that extended across multiple families and generations. Mrs. Mordaunt's attempt to expose this injustice had been morally justified, but her methods had led to tragedy. Dr. Haydock arrived as the formal discussions concluded, bringing news about Mrs. Mordaunt's condition following her arrest. "She's suffering from severe depression and anxiety," he reported. "The guilt over Arthur's death has affected her profoundly. I've recommended that she receive medical treatment during her detention." Inspector Slack, who had been conducting additional interviews with the affected families, joined them with updates on the investigation's broader implications. "We've identified at least 12 families who are aware of the land fraud and benefited from it over the years. Most claim ignorance of the specific details, but several had clear knowledge of irregularities in their property holdings. Miss Marple was not surprised by this revelation. In her experience, family secrets had a way of being passed down through generations, even when the explicit details were obscured by time and selective memory. Inspector, will there be additional criminal charges filed against the families who knowingly benefited from the fraud? That's being determined at a higher level, Inspector Slack replied diplomatically. The focus appears to be on restitution rather than punishment for historical crimes. Most of the original perpetrators have been dead for decades, and their descendants could argue they were merely inheriting family property in good faith. The afternoon sun was slanting through the vestry window, casting familiar patterns of light and shadow across the room where Arthur Pence had spent his final moments. Miss Marple considered the complex interplay of justice, guilt, and redemption that characterized the case's resolution. There's something to be said, she observed quietly, for the idea that sins can be inherited across generations, even when the specific knowledge of those sins is lost. Mrs. Mordaunt understood that her family's prosperity was built on theft, and she felt a moral obligation to make restitution. Perhaps that impulse toward justice, however tragically executed, represents a form of inherited conscience. Morrison gathered his papers as the meeting concluded, his expression reflecting the satisfaction of a difficult investigation nearing completion. The Land Registry expects to complete the property transfers within 6 months. It will be one of the largest restitution efforts in British legal history. As the various officials departed, Miss Marple remained in the vestry for a few moments longer, her thoughts turning to Arthur Pence and the faithful service that had cost him his life. His dedication to precise record-keeping and financial integrity had made him an unwitting guardian of secrets that others preferred to keep hidden. In the end, his commitment to truth had been both his greatest virtue and the cause of his death. The mystery of the halfpenny had revealed itself to be a story about the persistence of historical injustice and the complex moral obligations that pass from one generation to the next. The coin itself had been merely a signal, a small piece of metal carrying the weight of enormous secrets across the decades, until someone finally found the courage to speak the truth, and someone else found the desperation to silence it forever. Chapter 10. The Final Collection. The following Sunday marked exactly 1 week since Arthur Pence's death, and the congregation of St. Mary Mead gathered for a memorial service that would serve as both tribute and conclusion to the events that had shaken their quiet community. The church was fuller than usual, with many parishioners who had not attended regularly in years, coming to pay their respects to a man whose dedication had been both exemplary and ultimately fatal. Miss Marple took her customary seat in the third pew, noting how the familiar routine of Sunday worship carried an undercurrent of unspoken knowledge about the secrets that had been revealed. The Weatherby family pew stood empty. Sir Reginald had departed the village to stay with relatives, while his solicitors managed the complex property transfers. Several other families associated with the Victorian land fraud were also notably absent, their participation in village life temporarily suspended, while the legal implications of their ancestors' crimes were resolved. The Reverend Clement's sermon focused on themes of forgiveness and redemption, though Miss Marple detected in his carefully chosen words an awareness that the congregation was grappling with questions that went far beyond ordinary spiritual concerns. How does a community process the revelation that its most respected families had built their status on systematic theft? How do individuals reconcile inherited privilege with inherited guilt? During the offertory, Miss Marple observed the collection process with particular attention, remembering how Arthur's keen eye had first noticed the unusual Victorian halfpenny that had set the entire investigation in motion. The collection plates moved through the congregation with their usual dignity, receiving the modest offerings of a rural community that had never been wealthy but had always been generous within its means. When the collection reached Miss Marple's pew, she made her customary contribution of £1, but she also added something else, a small envelope containing a note she had written the night before. As the plate continued its journey toward the altar, she watched to see if anyone else noticed her unusual offering. Inspector Slack, seated in the back of the church in his official capacity, caught her eye and nodded slightly. He had agreed to her request that he observe the final resolution of the case, understanding that some mysteries required ceremonial closure as well as legal conclusion. After the service, as the congregation gathered in the churchyard for their usual post-worship socialising, Miss Marple approached the Reverend Clement, who was preparing to count the morning's collection in the vestry, a duty that would remain his until a replacement treasurer could be appointed. "Reverend," she said quietly, "you'll find something unusual in this morning's collection. I thought it important to complete the story that Arthur began investigating." In the vestry, they opened the envelope Miss Marple had contributed. Inside was a single sheet of paper on which she had written a detailed explanation of Mrs. Mordaunt's investigation, the Victorian land fraud conspiracy, and Arthur Pence's role in uncovering the truth. The document served as both historical record and tribute to Arthur's memory. "This should be preserved in the parish archives," Miss Marple suggested. "Future generations should understand what Arthur died for, and why his dedication to precise record-keeping was so important to revealing the truth about our community's history." The Reverend read the document carefully, his expression reflecting the complex emotions of someone processing revelations that challenged everything he thought he knew about his parish. "I had no idea that such extensive fraud had shaped our village's development," he murmured. "The families involved seemed so respectable." "Respectability can be inherited along with property, Reverend," Miss Marple nodded with understanding. "But so can the moral obligations that accompany historical injustice. Mrs. Mordaunt understood this, even if her methods were tragically flawed." As they spoke, Dr. Haydock arrived with news about Mrs. Mordaunt's legal situation. "The prosecutor has agreed to reduce the charges to involuntary manslaughter," he reported. "Given her cooperation with the land registry investigation and her obvious remorse, she'll likely receive a suspended sentence with community service obligations." This news brought some measure of relief to Miss Marple, who had hoped that the legal system would recognise the tragic nature of Mrs. Mordaunt's crime. The older woman had been trying to serve justice, even if her final desperate act had produced injustice. Inspector Slack joined them in the vestry, bringing the official conclusion to his investigation. "The land registry has completed their initial assessment of the property fraud," he said. 7 major estates will undergo partial transfer of ownership, affecting approximately 8,000 acres of land. The financial restitution will exceed £2 million. The scale of the fraud and its eventual correction was staggering, but Miss Marple found herself thinking about the human cost rather than the financial implications. Arthur Pence had died because someone feared the exposure of historical crimes. Mrs. Mordaunt would carry the guilt of his death for the rest of her life. Multiple families would face the loss of prosperity they had considered rightfully theirs. "The halfpenny that started it all," Miss Marple mused, thinking about the small coin that had carried such enormous significance. Such a modest signal to carry such enormous consequences. Inspector Slack had retained the original Victorian halfpenny as evidence, but he now withdrew it from his official envelope and placed it on the vestry table. Morrison from the land registry suggested it should be returned to the church collection, where Mrs. Mordaunt originally intended it to serve as a signal for justice. Miss Marple studied the coin one final time, noting again the carefully engraved initials WM that had identified its source. The halfpenny would return to circulation now, its secret message no longer needed, its purpose finally fulfilled through tragedy and revelation. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant across the village as the various participants in the week's drama prepared to return to their interrupted lives. The mystery had been solved, the criminals identified, the historical injustice exposed and addressed. But Miss Marple knew that the deeper questions raised by the case about inherited guilt, moral obligation, and the persistence of historical crimes would continue to resonate through the community for years to come. As she walked home through the familiar streets of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the lesson the halfpenny had taught them all. Sometimes the smallest signals carried the greatest weight, and the most innocent offerings could conceal the deepest secrets. Arthur Pence had died pursuing truth. Mrs. Mordaunt had committed a crime trying to serve justice, and an entire community had been forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that their prosperity might be built on historical crimes. The halfpenny would return to ordinary circulation now, its extraordinary message finally delivered. But the questions it had raised about guilt, inheritance, and moral obligation would linger in St. Mary Mead long after the legal proceedings concluded and the property transfers were completed. In her experience, Miss Marple had learned that the most profound mysteries were often those that revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature and the persistence of the past. The case of the halfpenny in the parish plate had been such a mystery, small in its beginnings, tragic in its resolution, but ultimately serving the cause of justice through the very complexity of its moral applications. As she reached her cottage gate, Miss Marple paused to look back toward the church spire. Rising above the village rooftops, Arthur Pence's memory would be honoured there, and his dedication to truth would be remembered as both inspiring and cautionary. The parish would find a new treasurer, the collection would continue its weekly rounds, and life would return to its familiar rhythms. But the halfpenny's message had been delivered, and its lesson would endure, that, in a community bound together by shared history and mutual dependence, the sins of one generation inevitably become the inheritance of the next, and justice, however long delayed, will eventually demand its due. The mystery was solved, but its deeper questions would echo through St. Mary Mead for generations to come. Thank you for joining us on Velvet Clues for this haunting tale of secrets, inheritance, and the price of truth. I'm Connor, and I hope you found Miss Marple's latest adventure as compelling as I have. These stories remind us that even in the quietest villages, the past never truly rests, and the smallest details can unveil the greatest mysteries. Until we meet again for another investigation, keep your eyes open for the unusual in the everyday. You never know what secrets might be hiding in plain sight.